The bar smelled like spilled engine oil and fried plasma worms, a place where mercenaries came to forget they were alive until the next war started. In the corner sat a man who looked more like wreckage than warrior. His jacket was torn, his hair uncombed, and his glass glowed with the kind of alien liquor that could burn through a ship's hull if left unattended. He swayed slightly, muttering to himself, while a group of reptilian mercenaries across the room burst into laughter. One slammed his claw against the table, nearly tipping it, and shouted for the entire place to hear. "Look at the human, drunk again. Earth sends its finest, huh?" The laughter rose, and the bar seemed to tilt toward the spectacle. The drunk raised his glass lazily, saluting their mockery with a sloppy grin, as if he had long ago made peace with being the galaxy's favorite joke. Eli Cross had been in that seat for hours, or maybe days. Time blurred when you had nothing to live for and too much to remember. He listened to the jeers without much expression, blinking slowly, letting their words pour over him like rain. He was used to this. Every alien in this part of the Outer Rim had a story about the weak humans who stumbled into galactic politics, picked a fight with empires older than their history books, and got flattened. He was the reminder of that defeat, the punchline given flesh. And maybe, on the surface, he was fine with that role. He smirked into his drink and muttered, "It's cheaper than paying rent." One of the mercenaries, a tusked brute with shoulders wide as a doorframe, swaggered over. His species thrived on intimidation, and he loomed above Eli's table like a walking mountain. "You humans," he sneered, "always trying to drown your shame. Tell me, drunkard, is your liver the only organ that works?" His friends howled with laughter. Eli tilted his head back, looking up at the alien with bleary eyes, then hiccuped dramatically. He tapped his glass against the table and answered, "Well, at least I've got a liver. Yours looks like it's hanging out of your neck." That got a spatter of laughter from another table, but it only made the brute's eyes narrow with rage. The bar was a dangerous place to run your mouth, but Eli had mastered the art of surviving with words. He leaned back in his chair, balancing precariously on two legs, and let the silence stretch long enough to annoy his audience. He had once been a soldier, once been sharp as the blade he carried, but nobody here knew that. They only knew the sloppy shell, the man who traded glory for another drink. That was fine. Sometimes the safest place to hide was in plain sight, disguised as a joke. The mockery resumed, spreading like wildfire through the room. Someone began imitating a staggering human, arms flopping like noodles. Another pounded the table in rhythm, chanting weak meat, until half the room joined in. Eli's eyelids drooped, and for a moment he looked like he might collapse forward into his own drink. But then something changed. One mercenary, emboldened by the chorus, shouted louder than the rest. "The only thing humans are good for is dying first." That silenced the laughter, not because the insult was clever, but because it cut too deep. Eli placed his glass gently on the table. The sound it made against the wood was sharp enough to slice through the thick air. He sat still, shoulders relaxed, head lowered. The crowd leaned forward, sensing something, though they didn't know what. Slowly, deliberately, Eli rose to his feet. His chair scraped back across the floor, the sound grating and metallic. The mercenary in front of him sneered, preparing for an easy shove to send him sprawling. Instead, Eli straightened his spine, and the sway in his posture vanished. His eyes, no longer bleary, locked with the brute's, steady and cold. The shift was small but unmistakable. The room, once roaring with laughter, grew silent. The mercenaries glanced at one another, their mocking grins faltering. Eli's voice carried in the silence, low but clear, each word enunciated with surgical precision. "You wanted a story," he said, his lips curling into something between a smile and a snarl. "Let me tell you one." The bar seemed to inhale as one, holding its breath. For the first time, the aliens saw something other than a drunk human. They saw something coiled, something patient, something dangerous. Eli picked up his glass again, raised it in a mock toast, and swallowed what was left in one gulp. The liquid burned all the way down, but his expression never flinched. He set the glass down, then pointed a finger at the brute in front of him. You think you know humans because you've heard stories told by people who were afraid of us. But fear tells lousy history. The brute opened his mouth to retort, but Eli's hand moved faster than the eye could follow. He snatched the knife out of the alien's belt and slammed it into the table between them. The wood split with a crack. No one in the room moved. Eli leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper, though every ear strained to catch it. I'll show you what happens when you mistake silence for weakness. Then he sat back down, as if nothing had happened, and poured himself another drink from a bottle that had appeared on the table. The knife still quivered in the wood. The brute stepped back, his expression unreadable, and for the first time all night, no one laughed. The bar was quiet, the air heavy with a new kind of tension. The mercenaries watched Eli as if seeing him for the first time. They had come expecting entertainment at the expense of a drunk human. What they got instead was the promise of something far more dangerous. And as Eli drank again, his lips curling into the faintest of smiles, one thought echoed through the stunned silence of the room. The joke was over. The silence in the bar stretched into something that felt heavier than gravity. Every mercenary in the room leaned back, measuring the man they had mocked only moments ago. Eli sat there as though nothing had changed, his hand casually wrapped around the neck of the bottle, pouring himself another glass with the steadiness of a surgeon. The knife he had slammed into the table still trembled faintly, vibrating against the grain. His eyes were calm, but the calmness carried the weight of someone who had seen too much to ever be rattled by a drunk joke. The mercenary brute who had stood over him a moment ago was suddenly very interested in not meeting his gaze. The bar's laughter had curdled into unease. Eli leaned back in his chair and said nothing at first, letting the silence do the work. He drank, set the glass down, and finally spoke. "You all think you know humans," he began, his voice low but with a resonance that made the room listen. "You think the war ended because we were weak, because we bent our knees." He smiled faintly, though it was not a smile of humor but one of bitterness. "That's the story you were told. That's the story you wanted to believe. But I was there. I know what really happened." The mercenaries exchanged glances, uneasy now, but none dared interrupt. Eli's gaze drifted to the ceiling as if he were watching a scene projected there. It was 20 years ago. The humans had just been introduced to the galaxy. Too loud, too bold, too desperate to prove we belonged. Every empire took turns breaking us down, testing how quickly we'd collapse. And collapse we did. Cities burned, fleets shattered. Earth became a battlefield no one wanted but everyone wanted to control. He paused, his voice dropping lower. But what they didn't expect was that we wouldn't stop fighting, even when there was nothing left worth fighting for. He laughed suddenly, the sound sharp, almost startling. "They called us reckless. Said we fought like animals?" Maybe they were right. But what they didn't see was the pattern in the chaos. What looked like desperation was strategy. What looked like madness was method. I was part of a unit that lived inside that madness. We were called the Ghost Squad. And for good reason. The room stirred uneasily at the name. A few of the older mercenaries furrowed their brows as if they recognized it from some half-buried rumor. Eli leaned forward, his elbows on the table, and his voice carried the tone of someone reliving a memory that refused to fade. "They picked us because we were already broken. Soldiers who had lost everything. Men and women who didn't care if they lived or died. They trained us to vanish, to strike where no one thought possible, to survive missions that were supposed to be suicide. And we did. Over and over again." He closed his eyes, recalling. "I remember one mission in particular. Officially, it never happened. According to your history books, it ended with the annihilation of a human colony fleet. A great victory for the empire that crushed us." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Except that wasn't the whole story. We were sent behind their lines, just 12 of us, no backup, no chance of return. Our orders were to make them bleed enough that they'd think twice about calling it a victory. And bleed they did. By the time the fleet finished celebrating, half their forward supply chain was gone, a dozen officers were dead, and their weapons stockpile was missing." One mercenary scoffed, unable to help himself. "Lies," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Eli turned his head slowly toward the voice, and the silence that followed pressed the doubter back into his seat. Lies don't leave scars, Eli said quietly. Then he tugged up the sleeve of his jacket and showed a thick, jagged mark running along his forearm, the kind that spoke of more than just a knife fight. He let the room see it, then let the sleeve fall again. Believe what you want. The truth doesn't need your approval. The bar was no longer a place of mockery. It was a courtroom, and Eli was both witness and judge. He poured another drink, though this time he didn't touch it. His eyes fixed on the liquid as though it held the reflection of the past. Ghost Squad was never supposed to be remembered. We were ghosts for a reason. Our victories were erased, our sacrifices buried, because humanity needed the galaxy to underestimate us. If they knew what we were capable of, if they saw the monster we could become when cornered, they'd have united to wipe us out completely. He looked up, and his eyes swept across the room. That's why I sit here like this. Why I played the drunk, the fool, the coward. Because the day the galaxy realizes what humans really are is the day they stop mocking us and start fearing us. And fear, once it takes root, grows into extermination. The mercenaries shifted uncomfortably. They were warriors, killers, pirates and soldiers, but they understood fear. They had used it often, thrived on it. To hear a human speak of wielding it like a weapon unsettled them in a way blasters and blades never could. Eli's tone softened, almost wistful. The war nobody won, that's what they called it. But we knew better. We didn't win. We didn't lose. We endured. That was the human victory. We showed we could bleed and still stand. We showed we could be ghosts and still haunt every empire that tried to bury us. He reached for the untouched glass, raised it in another mock toast, and drank. The burn seemed to fuel his words as he set it back down with a soft thud. You think I'm a drunk. Maybe I am. But I'm also the last man alive from Ghost Squad. And the ghosts don't stop hunting just because the war is over. The mercenaries stared at him, a mix of doubt, fascination, and unease flickering across their faces. Some wanted to laugh it off, to dismiss the entire tale as the ramblings of a bitter man. But the way Eli's voice carried, the way his eyes never wavered, and the scars hidden beneath his clothing whispered otherwise. No one spoke. Not even the brute who had mocked him first. The only sound was the hum of the bar's ancient ventilation system, buzzing like an insect. Eli leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a brief moment. He looked tired but not weak. Never weak. When he opened his eyes again, he let them drift across the crowd, his gaze resting on each mercenary as though measuring them. Some looked away. Others held his gaze but with unease. Finally, he let the silence settle once more before muttering, almost to himself, "The galaxy thinks humans are finished. That's the best joke I've ever heard." The laughter did not return. The bar remained heavy with the weight of the story, and every mercenary present knew, whether they admitted it or not, that something about their perception of the drunk human had shifted forever. The silence following Eli's words weighed on the bar like a storm cloud refusing to break. Every mercenary present shifted in their seats, unsettled by the tale they had just heard. Some still doubted, telling themselves the man was nothing more than a drunken storyteller with scars and a sharp tongue. Others believed every word but were too proud to admit it. A few, however, felt something they had not expected to feel in that place: respect. Eli let the tension hang in the air, his calm demeanor never wavering. It was as if he were daring someone to speak, daring someone to call him a liar outright. Finally, one did. The hulking reptilian mercenary, the same one who had mocked Eli first, slammed his clawed hand against the table and snarled. Enough of this ghost story. You want us to believe humans are some kind of hidden terror? Prove it. You're just another sack of weak flesh hiding behind words. If you had half the skill you claim, you'd show it. His voice rumbled like stone grinding against stone, and the challenge was clear. The other mercenaries perked up, eager for something tangible, something they could cheer or mock. The brute sneered at Eli, flashing jagged teeth. Unless, of course, the drunk doesn't want to embarrass himself. Eli remained seated for a moment longer, letting the insult roll through the air. Then he slowly stood, stretching as though his bones ached, giving off the impression that the years had weighed heavily on him. He adjusted his jacket, took one last sip from the bottle, and set it down gently. His eyes, calm and sharp, locked with the brute's. "If words aren't enough," he said evenly, "then let's speak in the language you understand." The room erupted with excitement. Chairs scraped back as mercenaries gathered around, forming a circle. They banged on tables and shouted, eager for the entertainment of a pit fight. The mock combat pit was a tradition in this kind of establishment, a way for mercenaries to settle disputes without blowing the place to rubble. The rules were simple: step in, fight until one man can no longer stand, and no one intervenes. Bets were already being shouted, credits changing hands, though the odds were laughably skewed against Eli. Almost no one bet on the human. Almost no one thought he would last more than a minute. Eli stepped into the pit, his movements still deliberate, measured. He gave no sign of nerves, no sign of fear, though his appearance still carried the air of weariness, a man dragging himself toward an inevitable beating. The brute opposite him grinned with savage glee, flexing his claws and rolling his shoulders. He was taller, heavier, and covered in natural armor plating that shimmered under the bar's dim lights. His laughter filled the room. "This will be quick." The fight began with a roar from the crowd. The brute lunged forward, swinging a massive claw aimed to knock Eli clean off his feet. Eli stumbled back clumsily, almost tripping over himself, and the bar erupted in laughter. It seemed the drunk human was about to be humiliated exactly as expected. The brute advanced again, his swings wide and confident, each one missing Eli by mere inches as Eli staggered and dodged with the appearance of sheer luck. The mercenaries jeered, shouting insults, but then something subtle began to shift. What at first looked like clumsy dodging became suspiciously precise. Each stumble carried Eli just far enough to avoid a blow. Each sway seemed to draw the brute in, overextending, making him commit more force than he intended. What looked like drunken chaos was beginning to resemble a dance, one with a rhythm only Eli seemed to hear. The brute grew angrier, his attacks sloppier, his growls louder. He swung with both arms, trying to crush the smaller man outright, but Eli twisted at the last second, letting the attack slam into the ground. The brute's claws dug into the floor, stuck for the briefest moment, and Eli struck. It was not a heavy blow, not even close. Eli's fist cracked against the alien's jaw with a speed so quick that half the room missed it. The brute staggered back in shock, more from the fact that he had been struck at all than from the pain. The laughter faltered, replaced by murmurs. Eli straightened his spine, and the drunken wobble disappeared entirely. His eyes gleamed with the sharpness of a predator who had spent a lifetime hiding among prey. The brute roared and charged again, this time with reckless fury. Eli sidestepped, hooked the alien's arm, and used the momentum to spin him sideways. The alien crashed into the pit wall, rattling the entire structure. Gasps filled the bar. Eli did not press the attack. He simply stood there, calm, controlled, waiting for the next move. The brute scrambled up, humiliated now, his pride screaming louder than his body. He lunged again, and again Eli avoided him, letting him wear himself down, letting the mistakes pile up until the brute was panting with exertion. Then, in a blur, Eli struck again. His movements were a storm, fast and efficient, each blow targeted with precision. A strike to the throat, a jab under the ribs, a hook behind the knee. The brute collapsed, coughing and gasping, unable to rise. The crowd was stunned into silence. Eli stood over his opponent, breathing evenly, not a single sign of strain on his face. He looked around the circle, his gaze sharp and unwavering, before speaking. Never mistake silence for weakness. His words cut through the quiet like a blade. Humans didn't survive because we were strong. We survived because we learned how to let you think we were weak until it was too late. The brute groaned on the ground, clutching his side, unable to continue. The fight was over, and everyone knew it. The silence of the crowd was not born of respect alone, but of realization. The drunk they had mocked had just dismantled a warrior twice his size without breaking a sweat. The bets were forgotten, the laughter extinguished. The human in front of them was not a joke. He was something else entirely, something dangerous, something they had underestimated. Eli bent down, picked up the bottle he had left at the edge of the pit, and raised it in a casual toast. The faintest smirk touched his lips. To patience, he said. To the weapon everyone ignores until it cuts their throat. The crowd remained hushed as he stepped out of the pit, leaving the brute wheezing on the floor. The mercenaries watched him with new eyes, no longer seeing the drunk human slouched in the corner, but the ghost of a warrior who had survived wars no one admitted had been fought. Eli returned to his chair, poured himself another drink, and took a slow sip. The knife still quivered in the table nearby, a reminder of the man they had underestimated. The bar did not laugh anymore. Instead, it buzzed with quiet whispers, each mercenary grappling with the image of a human who had been both fool and phantom, prey and predator. And Eli, sitting calmly once more, allowed himself a small smile. The mask of the drunkard was cracked now, and the galaxy would never look at him the same way again. The pit fight had ended, but the silence it left behind lingered like smoke after a fire. Eli sat once again in his chair, the bottle close at hand, his posture relaxed as though he had done nothing more strenuous than stretch his legs. Around him, the mercenaries whispered in hushed tones, casting uncertain glances his way. The mocking grins had vanished, replaced by something that hovered uneasily between respect and fear. The brute he had dismantled still lay slumped against the pit wall, wheezing faintly, his pride broken more than his body. No one stepped forward to help him. No one dared break the tension. The quiet cracked at last when a slow clap echoed from the back of the bar. The sound carried easily, each strike deliberate, mocking, and measured. All heads turned toward the source. A figure stepped out from the shadows near the far wall, tall and cloaked, his movements too smooth, too practiced, to belong to a common mercenary. He strolled forward, his presence bending the room like gravity itself. The crowd parted instinctively as he passed, their earlier whispers silenced by his arrival. Eli's eyes lifted, watching him with the calm of a man who had expected something like this all along. The figure stopped just short of the pit, his face revealed under the dim light. His skin shimmered with an iridescent sheen, the mark of a Zyuri commander, one of the galaxy's most ruthless species of tacticians. His voice, when he spoke, was deep and silk-smooth, carrying with it the kind of authority that silenced lesser men. Impressive, human? Very impressive. He glanced at the broken brute with a faint smirk. I imagine it has been some time since you reminded anyone what your kind is capable of. Eli said nothing, merely raised the bottle and poured himself another glass. The commander's smile grew thinner. Allow me to introduce myself. I am Commander Valen of the Syndicate. I have been following your career. Though, to be fair, you have gone to great lengths to appear as though you had none. The mention of the Syndicate drew uneasy murmurs from the mercenaries. Even hardened killers knew better than to cross them. They were not an empire or a military but something worse, a shadow network of power brokers who thrived in the spaces between governments. The fact that a commander of theirs stood here meant this night had just turned from curiosity to danger. Eli drank deeply, set the glass down, and leaned back in his chair, eyes locked on Valen. You've been watching a drunk sit in bars, he said flatly. You must be very bored. Valen's smirk did not fade. On the contrary, it sharpened. You mistake boredom for patience. There is a difference. He reached into his cloak and pulled out a data wafer, setting it down on the nearest table. A holographic display shimmered into life, casting a faint glow across the room. The image was of Eli Cross, though not as the bar had seen him tonight. This image showed a younger man in military gear, his eyes hard, his posture sharp, a ghost of the soldier he had once been. Above the image, text scrolled in alien glyphs, numbers, and credits. A bounty. Gasps rippled through the mercenaries as they read the figure. It was enormous, more money than most of them would see in a lifetime. Alive. The word pulsed above Eli's image, making the conditions clear. Valen looked around the bar, letting the weight of the offer settle over the crowd. A very generous reward for anyone who delivers this man breathing. You see, Eli Cross is no drunk. He is the last of the ghost squad. And the syndicate has decided his ghosting days are over. The shift in the room was immediate and electric. The mercenaries looked at one another, greed and fear colliding in their expressions. The drunken human they had mocked minutes ago was now a prize worth more than fleets of ships. Old loyalties, if any existed, crumbled in the face of such temptation. Valen's smile widened, confident that the crowd would do his work for him. Eli let the silence sit, then poured another drink. He raised the glass, studying the liquid like it might hold answers. Finally, he spoke, his voice casual, almost amused. "That's an awful lot of money for one washed-up soldier. Makes me wonder what you're so afraid I'll do if I'm left breathing." Valen's eyes narrowed slightly, but his smile did not break. "Fear is not the word. Concern, perhaps. A man like you carries truths that are inconvenient. And inconvenient truths can unravel empires." He gestured to the mercenaries. "But no matter. There is not a man in this room foolish enough to turn down the chance to be rich beyond imagining." The crowd stirred, weapons shifting subtly, eyes turning toward Eli. The tension was suffocating now, 100 decisions waiting to snap into violence. Eli let the moment stretch, then laughed quietly. It was not the laugh of a drunk this time, but of someone who found humor in the sharpest edge of danger. He set the glass down, the sound sharp against the table. "I suppose I should be flattered. But if any of you are thinking of cashing in, there's one thing you ought to know." He stood suddenly, moving with a speed that shocked the room. His hand darted out, snatching the bottle from the table. In one smooth motion, he flung it at the wall behind him. The glass shattered, and instead of liquor, clear water sprayed out, hissing against the lights and spilling across the floor. The crowd blinked in confusion, struggling to process what they had seen. "I wasn't drinking," Eli said, his voice calm, his eyes burning with something dangerous. "Not tonight. Not any night. The drunk you've mocked for years was nothing more than a mask. A cover. And you all bought it, every last one of you." The realization struck the mercenaries like a physical blow. The stumbling fool they had laughed at was an act. The constant drinking, the slurred speech, the vacant stares, all of it deliberate. And in that moment, staring at the man who now stood sharp and unflinching, the crowd understood the depth of their mistake. Valen's smile faded at last, replaced by a cold scowl. "Clever, human? But cleverness will not save you now." He gestured, and several mercenaries drew their weapons, greed winning out over hesitation. The room erupted into chaos as chairs toppled, tables overturned, and blades hissed free of their sheaths. Eli, already moving, grabbed the knife still buried in the wood of his earlier display and spun it in his hand like an old friend. The first mercenary lunged, and Eli sidestepped, driving the knife into his shoulder before ripping it free. He used the body as a shield against a blaster bolt, then hurled it aside. The bar exploded into violence, the air filled with shouts, the crack of weapons, the crash of breaking glass. Eli moved through the chaos with the precision of a man who had done this too many times before. Every strike was efficient, every movement calculated. For the mercenaries, the fight was no longer a matter of sport or mockery. It was survival. The bounty glimmered in their minds, but so too did the sharp edge of the truth Eli had revealed. He was not weak, not drunk, not harmless. He was the ghost who had haunted wars, the man they had all underestimated. And now, caught in the storm he had unleashed, they began to realize just how dangerous a human could be when he chose to stop hiding. The bar was no longer a place of drink and laughter. It had become a battlefield in miniature, its walls echoing with the shouts of mercenaries scrambling for credits, and the crack of weapons drawn in greed. Eli moved like water through the chaos, never staying in one place long enough to be cornered. He ducked under a swinging blade, shoved a table into the path of a plasma bolt, and slid across the slick floor to kick another mercenary's legs out from under him. Every motion was efficient, born of repetition, the kind of skill that comes from years of surviving missions where the margin between life and death was measured in heartbeats. The patrons had walked into this fight thinking they were hunting prey. Instead, they had awoken a predator. Bodies began to litter the floor, groaning and clutching wounds, but Eli was careful. He killed only when he had no choice. Most he left broken but breathing, each one a warning that he was not what they thought he was. In the chaos, Commander Valen watched from the edge of the room, his smirk gone, replaced by a cold calculation. He saw in Eli what few had ever seen and fewer had lived to tell about. He saw the truth behind the mask. Eli vaulted over the bar counter and took cover as a hail of blaster fire ripped through the shelves, shattering bottles and filling the air with the stench of alien spirits. He crouched low, catching his breath, his knife still wet with blood. For a moment, he let himself feel the weight of the mask he had carried for so long. The drunk, the fool, the broken soldier. He had worn that face for years because it kept the galaxy blind. Now the mask had shattered, and the truth was spilling into the open whether he wanted it to or not. He rose again, ducking under the bar and charging forward, his knife flashing in tight arcs as he cut down two mercenaries who had gotten too close. The fight shifted as some of the mercenaries hesitated, their greed beginning to war with their survival instincts. Eli stood amidst them, his chest heaving, his voice rising above the noise. "You don't get it, do you? You think this is about money, about some bounty. But it isn't. This has never been about me. It's about what I know." The words cut through the battle more sharply than his blade. A few mercenaries paused, eyes flicking toward Valen. Eli pressed forward, seizing their hesitation. "The Syndicate wants me alive because I carried the truth they buried. You all laugh at Earth's defeat, but it was never a defeat. It was a story written for you, to keep you complacent, to keep you from questioning why they let us live." A clawed mercenary lunged, snarling, but Eli grabbed his arm, twisted it sharply, and slammed the alien to the ground with a crack. He stepped over the body, his voice rising again. "They didn't spare us because we were weak. They spared us because we scared them. Because when humans fight, when we have nothing left, we become something even the Syndicate couldn't control. That's the truth they don't want you to hear." The room stilled for the briefest moment, the clash of combat faltering under the weight of his words. Valen's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. "Enough," he snapped, his voice a whip. "Do not listen to this relic. He is a liar, a failed soldier clinging to stories no one remembers. Bring him to me." But Eli's words had already taken root. The mercenaries, rough killers though they were not strangers to being lied to by those who claimed power. They lived in the cracks between empires, prey to the whims of syndicates and rulers who treated them as tools. And now, here stood a human, the very species they had been taught to laugh at, declaring that their laughter was built on a lie. That they, too, were victims of a story rewritten to control them. Doubt flickered in their eyes, weakening the hold of greed. Eli seized a fallen blaster and aimed it at the ceiling. The shot exploded through the rafters, showering sparks down on the room, and the noise silenced all movement. He turned slowly, addressing every mercenary present. "You think I sat in bars for years because I had nothing left? No. I sat there because I was waiting. Waiting for the moment the Syndicate got greedy enough to come for me in the open. Waiting for them to show their hand. And now they have." He pointed the blaster toward Valen, his gaze steady. "The bounty isn't about me. It's about what I know, and if they silence me, they silence the proof that they've been lying to all of you." The mercenaries looked from Eli to Valen, their loyalties wavering, their weapons no longer pointed with certainty. Some began to lower their arms, unwilling to fight further. The commander's scowl deepened, his calm beginning to fray. "Enough of this charade," he barked, drawing a sleek blade from beneath his cloak. His voice was sharp, commanding. "You are nothing but a man hiding behind words. Let us see how long those words last when your blood stains the floor." Eli stepped forward, tossing the blaster aside, his knife gleaming in the dim light. His voice was calm, almost mocking. "At least I don't need to buy an audience to believe me." The room parted as the two men closed the distance, the chaos subsiding into a tense circle of silence. Every mercenary leaned forward, not sure if they were about to witness a death or the unraveling of something far larger. The duel began with no ceremony. Valen lunged with inhuman speed, his blades slashing toward Eli's throat. Eli parried with the hilt of his knife, twisting out of reach. The commander pressed the attack, his strikes fluid and precise, honed from years of training. Eli answered with efficiency, blocking, dodging, countering with quick cuts meant not to kill but to test. The clash of steel rang through the bar, each strike punctuated by the ragged breaths of the crowd. As the fight wore on, Eli began to speak again, his words timed with each movement. You've built an empire on fear. On lies. You've convinced them that humans are nothing. But we are the reminder that even the smallest flame can burn down a galaxy if you let it. His blade slipped past Valen's guard, cutting a shallow line across the commander's arm. The alien hissed in pain, his composure cracking. The crowd erupted in shouts, some cheering, some jeering, but all watching with feverish attention. Eli pressed harder, his movements a storm, his strikes carrying not only precision but purpose. The Syndicate cannot control the truth forever, he growled, driving Valen back step by step. And tonight, in this pit of mercenaries and killers, the truth finally has a voice. Valen's snarl was animalistic as he swung wildly, desperation creeping into his attacks. Eli sidestepped, pivoted, and slammed his shoulder into the commander's chest, sending him sprawling to the floor. He stood over him, knife poised, chest heaving with controlled fury. Around them, the mercenaries held their breath. For the first time, they looked not at a drunk or even a soldier, but at a man who had carried the truth through fire and shadows, waiting for the moment it could no longer be denied. Valen glared up at him, rage and fear mingling in his eyes. Kill me, human, he spat, and prove to them you are nothing more than the monster we told them you were. Eli froze for a moment, his blade steady, his eyes locked on the man beneath him. Then he lowered the knife, his voice cutting sharper than any blade. No. I'll let them decide which of us is the monster. The air in the bar felt thick with smoke and tension, though either came from the broken lights and scattered fire pits. It came from the weight of the moment, the collective breath held by every mercenary as Eli stood there, knife lowered, and Commander Valen struggled back to his feet. The Syndicate commander's cloak was torn, his blade still gripped tightly in his hand, his iridescent skin streaked with a line of blood that glistened under the dim light. He looked less like an untouchable ruler, and more like a man cornered. Eli, steady and calm, let the silence settle before him like a shield. Around them, the mercenaries shifted, no longer sure if they were spectators, would-be bounty hunters, or witnesses to history unraveling. Valen straightened, his breathing sharp, his composure cracked but not shattered. His voice rang out with icy venom, each word dripping with authority. You think this changes anything? You think your little story will undo centuries of control? He raised his blade and pointed it at Eli. Kill me or don't, it makes no difference. The Syndicate will erase you, as they erase every inconvenient truth. That is our way. That is survival. Eli stepped forward, knife in hand, his movements precise and deliberate. His expression carried no mockery, no smirk, only the calm resolve of someone who had long ago accepted his role. You've mistaken survival for control. They aren't the same. You control with lies. We survive with truth. He circled slowly, his eyes never leaving Valen's. And the truth always comes out, no matter how long you bury it. The crowd pressed closer, every eye fixed on them. Some of the mercenaries murmured under their breath. The seeds of doubt Eli had planted now roots growing fast. They weren't thinking about the bounty anymore. They were thinking about the possibility that their entire understanding of history had been twisted. Valen could feel it too, the cracks spreading through the crowd, weakening the grip of the Syndicate's story. It made him desperate. He lunged, faster than before, his blade flashing in a precise thrust aimed for Eli's chest. But Eli had fought too many battles, faced too many moments where a single second meant the difference between living and dying. He twisted aside, catching Valen's wrist, and with a sharp twist forced the commander's blade downward. The knife in Eli's hand pressed against Valen's throat, the two locked in a frozen tableau that made the entire room still. Every mercenary leaned forward, the sound of their collective breathing loud in the silence. Eli's voice was low, but it carried through the room with the weight of a hammer. This is how the syndicate works. They tell you what to believe, and you repeat it until it becomes truth. But the truth doesn't die just because someone pays you not to see it. He pressed the blade just enough to draw a thin line of blood. Humans learned that lesson the hard way. You tried to erase us, and we survived anyway. Valen's eyes burned with fury, but there was something else there too, fear. It was subtle, hidden beneath layers of pride, but Eli saw it. And in that moment, he understood something deeper. The syndicate had not spared humanity out of arrogance or oversight. They had spared them because they could not predict them. That unpredictability, that stubborn refusal to die when logic said they should, terrified them. Eli stepped back suddenly, releasing Valen and lowering his blade. He turned to the mercenaries instead, his voice rising with sharp conviction. This is what they fear. Not me. Not one human soldier. They fear what we represent. They fear what happens when you push someone to the edge and they refuse to fall. They fear the flame that survives the storm. He raised his knife high for them to see. And they should. The mercenaries erupted in a roar, not of mockery but of raw energy, the kind of sound that came when men who had been treated as tools saw a spark of rebellion they had not dared imagine. Some slammed their fists against tables, others shouted their approval, and all eyes turned away from Valen. The commander's control had slipped through his fingers, and no amount of credits could buy it back. Valen snarled, his pride wounded beyond repair, and he lunged again in desperation. But Eli was ready. The duel ended in a blur, Eli sidestepping, hooking his foot around the commander's leg, and driving him down. With a final motion, Eli twisted the knife free and sent Valen sprawling onto his back, disarmed, beaten, and humiliated before the very men he had sought to command. Eli stood over him, chest heaving but eyes steady. You wanted me alive, Eli said, his voice calm but firm. So I'll leave you breathing. Let the syndicate choke on the taste of their own fear. He stepped back, lowering his weapon, his decision carrying more weight than any death blow could have. Valen lay on the ground, trembling with rage, his defeat undeniable, his authority shattered. The mercenaries surged forward, but not to finish Eli. They moved to stand around him, their weapons lowered, their eyes alive with something that had been missing for too long: hope. For years they had lived in the cracks, laughed at the weak, obeyed the strong, and bowed to the syndicate's power. Now they had seen a man stand against it, not with riches, not with armies, but with truth and survival. And in that moment, they knew something fundamental had shifted. Eli raised his glass, one that had miraculously survived the chaos, filled with nothing more than clear water from a shattered bottle. He held it aloft, his voice carrying through the roar of the room. To humans, he said, his words sharp and deliberate. To the galaxy's best-kept secret. The mercenaries, who only hours ago had mocked him, raised their drinks in unison, their voices echoing his. To humans. The bars shook with the force of their roar, the sound rolling out into the night like a promise carried on the wind. Eli drank, the water burning his throat not with alcohol but with the weight of the life he had chosen to live. He set the glass down and looked around at the faces that had once laughed at him. They no longer saw a drunk, a broken soldier, or a ghost. They saw a man who had refused to die when the galaxy demanded it, and in that refusal, they saw themselves. Commander Valen crawled from the floor, his pride in ruins, his eyes burning with the knowledge that he would have to return to the syndicate empty-handed. Eli did not spare him another glance. He had made his point, and the syndicate would hear of it soon enough. He knew they would come again, stronger, more ruthless, unwilling to let their lies unravel so easily. But for tonight he had won. As the noise of the bar rose again, not in mockery but in celebration, Eli allowed himself the smallest of smiles. The mask was gone. The truth was loose. And for the first time in years, he no longer felt like a ghost hiding in plain sight. He felt alive. And that, he knew, was the syndicate's greatest fear of all.